The Johnson family had always been close-knit. They lived in a suburban neighborhood where children played outside until dusk and neighbors waved to each other over white picket fences. Life was simple, peaceful, and predictable. In this small, perfect world, the Johnsons had everything they needed: a beautiful home, a loving daughter named Emily, and a dog named Max. Max wasn't just any dog. He was a golden retriever, a breed known for its friendly nature and loyal temperament. The Johnsons had adopted him from a local shelter when Emily was just a baby. Max was barely a year old at the time, full of energy and excitement, and he instantly bonded with Emily. It didn't take long for him to find his place in their home. For the next 6 years, Max became an integral part of their family. He was there for every milestone: Emily's first steps, her first words, and every birthday and holiday in between. Max was always by her side, following her around the house, sleeping at the foot of her bed, and even sitting quietly beside her as she did her homework. He was gentle, affectionate, and protective, everything you could want in a family pet. Emily and Max shared a special bond. She would often talk to him as if he were another person, telling him about her day, her dreams, and her worries. Max would listen patiently, his warm brown eyes watching her with a look of understanding. There was something comforting about his presence, something that made Emily feel safe, no matter what. As the years went on, Max's loyalty never wavered. He became not just a pet, but a protector of the household. He was always alert, keeping an eye on everything, making sure his family was okay. The neighbors would sometimes laugh, remarking on how Max would sit by the front window, eyes trained on the street, as if he was on watch duty. But the Johnsons never thought much of it. They just assumed Max was being his usual self. At night, Max had his own bed in the living room, a cozy corner near the fireplace where he would curl up and drift off to sleep. Emily, too, had her own room upstairs where she'd sleep peacefully, tucked in tight under the covers. In those peaceful moments, the Johnsons never imagined that anything could disrupt the tranquility of their home. But that would change. The first sign came quietly, almost imperceptibly. It was late one night, just as Emily was drifting off to sleep. Max, who had been fast asleep on his bed, suddenly stirred. He sat up, his ears perked, his gaze fixed on the hallway leading to Emily's room. There was nothing unusual to see. No sound, no movement, but Max's behavior was different. And then it happened. A low growl. Soft at first, but distinct. It was the kind of growl you'd hear from a dog when something was wrong, when a stranger was near. But Max wasn't known to growl. He was calm, collected, and gentle. The growl echoed in the stillness of the night, sending a shiver down the Johnsons' spines. They glanced at each other, confused. What could have triggered Max to growl like that? Neither of them had heard a thing. They shook it off, assuming it was a bad dream or a fleeting moment of anxiety. But it wouldn't be the last time. The following night, the Johnsons went to bed as usual, though a subtle tension lingered in the air. Max had been quiet during the day, as he always was, but that eerie growl from the night before still echoed in their minds. They tried to brush it off, thinking maybe Max had been reacting to a noise outside, a car passing by, perhaps, or a squirrel scurrying along the fence. After all, dogs had sensitive hearing, and Max had always been a bit on edge when it came to strange sounds. However, the peace they hoped for was short-lived. Around the same time, just past midnight, the growling started again. This time, it was unmistakable. Max was sitting at the foot of Emily's bedroom door, his head low, his body tense. The growl was quiet at first, like a warning, but it gradually grew louder, more forceful, as though he was trying to tell them something. It was the kind of growl that suggested concern, even fear, not the playful, harmless growls Max sometimes made when he was excited, but something more serious. The Johnsons, now wide awake, exchanged worried glances. Was this just an odd quirk, or was something more going on? Emily, asleep in her room, seemed unaware of Max's behavior, her rhythmic breathing the only sound from inside. But Max wasn't backing down. He stayed fixed in his position, staring intently at the door, his eyes trained on it as if he could see something they couldn't. A chill ran through the parents. Maybe it's a bad dream, Sarah, Emily's mother suggested in a whisper, though she wasn't fully convinced. It seemed so unlike Max to act this way. If there was nothing physically wrong, why was he reacting so strongly? The noise continued for what felt like an eternity. Every time the growl subsided, it would pick up again, as if Max was waiting for something, waiting for a threat to make itself known. They tried to reassure themselves, but the unease in the air was palpable. Tom, Emily's father, eventually got out of bed and crept down the hallway. Max didn't move, though his growls softened when Tom approached. Reaching the living room, Tom checked the locks on the windows and doors. Everything appeared secure. No sign of forced entry, no sign of movement outside. Max's growling wasn't directed at anything he could see. It wasn't the usual bark at the wind behavior that dogs sometimes exhibit. This was focused, purposeful. Max seemed to be on alert for something hidden just beyond the reach of their understanding. Tom returned to bed, unsure of what to make of it all. Maybe we should call the vet, he suggested, though the idea felt ridiculous. Max had never shown any signs of aggression, and this behavior didn't seem to be out of any physical discomfort. It felt different, as if Max was reacting to something unseen, something that only he could sense. That night, Sarah lay awake, listening to the sound of Max's growls until, finally, the house fell silent again. She found no comfort in the quiet. The questions lingered, and the weight of uncertainty pressed down on her mind. Why was Max so fixated on Emily's room? What was he trying to protect them from? The days that followed brought no relief. Max's nightly growling became a routine, a dark shadow that loomed over the Johnsons' home. It wasn't just the noise itself, but the unsettling feeling it caused, creeping into the corners of their minds, making them question everything they knew about their dog. Why was Max growling only at night? Why was he so fixated on Emily's room? At first, they tried to explain it away. Perhaps it was a result of old age. Max was getting on in years, after all, and his senses might have been more easily triggered by sounds or shadows. Maybe he was sensing something unusual outside the house, like a stray animal wandering through the yard. But that didn't sit right with Sarah. She had never seen Max act like this before, not in the years they'd had him. His growls were different now, more urgent, more protective. They weren't the playful growls he made when he was chasing a ball or responding to a passing squirrel. These were deep, low growls that seemed to speak of danger. As each night passed, the growling became harder to ignore. Max's eyes would lock onto Emily's bedroom door with an intensity that unnerved the parents. He would sit, still as stone, until the growl began, softly at first, almost as though he was testing the air, before it deepened into a full guttural warning. The growls weren't only a sign of his discomfort. They seemed like a message, a sign that something was wrong, something hidden beneath the surface of their home. The Johnsons couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of dread. Was something wrong with Max? Had he developed some sort of behavioral issue, a strange obsession with Emily? Or was he trying to communicate something more urgent, something they weren't able to understand? That evening, after another restless night filled with Max growling, Sarah decided it was time to take action. She went online and researched dog behavior. Perhaps Max was responding to an environmental factor, something like a noise only he could hear, or perhaps a change in the air pressure that made him uneasy. But there was nothing in the articles that explained why Max's behavior seemed so specifically directed at Emily's room. No expert could tell her why her dog was acting this way. Feeling increasingly desperate, Sarah suggested to Tom that they get a second opinion. Maybe they needed to consult with a professional, a veterinarian, or even an animal behaviorist. But Tom wasn't convinced that Max's behavior was purely medical. There was something more going on, something deeper, something that made him uneasy in a way he couldn't quite put into words. It was then that they decided to take a more direct approach. They would try to observe Max's behavior more closely, in real time, and see if they could identify any patterns that might help explain his actions. So, they installed a baby monitor in Emily's room, just in case Max's growls weren't the only things they were missing. They wanted to know if Emily was reacting to something during her sleep. Maybe she was dreaming, or maybe she was sleepwalking and unintentionally triggering Max's protective instincts. For the first time, the Johnsons felt a strange mix of hope and fear. Hope that they would finally uncover the truth, but fear of what that truth might be. With the baby monitor now in place and the camera set up in the hallway, the Johnsons began their nightly vigil. They had hoped that, by observing Max more closely, they could pinpoint the cause of this strange behavior. It felt strange to treat their beloved pet like a subject of investigation, but they had no choice. The growling had become more than just an annoyance. It had become a source of deep unease, and they were desperate for answers. The first night of monitoring was almost painfully quiet. Max, as usual, settled into his spot outside Emily's bedroom door at the same time. Around 2:00 a.m., Sarah and Tom lay in their bed, listening intently through the baby monitor. They had placed it near Emily's bed, hoping that it would catch any sounds she might make during her sleep. What if she was talking in her sleep, or worse, moving around and unknowingly provoking Max? The camera, aimed down the hallway toward Emily's door, provided them with a live feed of the dimly lit corridor. At first, there was nothing unusual. Max sat quietly, staring at the door with his usual intensity. Sarah and Tom exchanged glances, wondering if they had overreacted. Maybe the growling had been a fluke after all. But then, as the minutes ticked by, something changed. Emily stirred in her sleep. Her breathing, soft and steady at first, became more erratic. She shifted in her bed, her tiny hands moving restlessly beneath the covers. It was nothing out of the ordinary, just a typical sign of a child dreaming. But there was something different about the way she moved. It seemed almost deliberate, as though she was responding to something. And then the growling began. Max's low, throaty growl echoed through the baby monitor. His posture was rigid, and he did not take his eyes off Emily's door. But this time, the growl didn't just stop. It persisted, growing louder and more intense, until it felt like the entire house was vibrating with its force. Max's gaze never wavered from the bedroom door. The parents held their breath, waiting for something. Anything that could explain what was happening. But it was Emily's sleep talk that began to unravel the mystery. From the baby monitor, they could hear her murmuring softly in her sleep, her voice unusually distant. It wasn't clear at first, but as she spoke again, Sarah caught a few words. "Go away. Leave me alone." Her words were so faint, so soft, they were almost drowned out by Max's growling. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Emily had never talked like this before. She was usually a peaceful sleeper, never prone to nightmares or restless movements. But now here she was, seemingly responding to someone or something in her dreams. Max's growl intensified, but then just as abruptly as it had started, it stopped. The hallway fell silent. Emily stopped moving, and Max slowly lay down on the floor, his eyes still locked on her door. For a moment, everything seemed normal again. Too normal, in fact. The camera feed showed nothing unusual. The silence was oppressive. Tom and Sarah exchanged worried looks. Was Emily talking to someone in her sleep? And if so, who or what was she talking to? Was Max growling at something real, something only he could sense? Or was there more to this story than they had realized? The questions only deepened, and the feeling of unease that had gripped the family began to tighten its hold. They were no closer to an answer, but one thing was certain. Something was happening in their home, something that no one could see but Max. The next night, Sarah and Tom were more determined than ever to uncover the truth. They had seen enough to know that something was not right, but they still couldn't make sense of it. Emily's sleep disturbances and Max's persistent growling were too connected, too synchronized to be a coincidence. It was as if the two were tied together by something neither of them understood. The sense of unease that had settled over their home had only grown stronger with each passing night. This time, Sarah decided to take a different approach. She set up the baby monitor in a more strategic position, closer to Emily's bed, with the microphone angled toward the window. Tom kept the hallway camera running, but they both knew it might not be enough. Something was missing from their earlier attempts to understand the situation, something they couldn't quite put their finger on. But as they watched, They hoped they would finally catch a break. Around 2 o'clock a.m., just like clockwork, Max took his usual position outside Emily's room. His behavior was more intense than ever. He was tense, alert, his body rigid. This time, however, there was an eerie stillness in the air, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The baby monitor clicked to life, and Sarah's heart skipped when she heard Emily's voice again. This time, it wasn't just a few mumbled words. It was a full sentence, clear and unmistakable. "They're here," Emily whispered in her sleep, her voice trembling. The words were soft, but the fear in her tone was palpable. "Don't let them take me." Mac's growling started again, low and deep. His eyes were locked on the same spot, the window by Emily's bed. His growl vibrated through the monitor, so strong it almost seemed to echo through the walls. Tom and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances. Emily's words sent a chill through them. Who was she talking about? What was she sensing in her dreams? Then, as the camera feed flickered, Sarah noticed something. It was subtle at first, barely visible against the dark silhouette of the room, but it was there. A shadow, a faint, dark shape that seemed to move outside Emily's window. It wasn't the shadow of a tree or a passing cloud. This was different. It was unmistakably human. The figure seemed to hover just outside the window, its outline barely distinguishable from the darkness. It didn't move like someone simply passing by. It lingered just long enough for Max to sense it. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched the shadow shift slightly, as if peering inside the room. It was then that Max's growl reached its peak, louder, more urgent. He barked once, the sound sharp and piercing, and the shadow seemed to vanish as quickly as it had appeared. Emily, still asleep, shifted in her bed but didn't wake. Max, however, didn't relax. He remained fixed on the window, his growl still low and warning, as if challenging the darkness itself. Tom quickly got out of bed and rushed toward the window, pulling back the blinds to find nothing but the dark yard outside. There were no signs of anyone, no footprints, no movement. Just an empty, quiet yard bathed in moonlight. But as he looked around, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was just out of sight, lurking in the edges of the darkness. He stepped back, a feeling of dread creeping up his spine. Was it possible that someone had been lurking around their home? That someone had been watching them, or worse, had been watching Emily? He couldn't believe what he had just seen. The shadow outside the window wasn't a trick of the light. It had been real. Max had known. The dog had been reacting to someone outside. But how had they never noticed before? The couple stood in silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on them. They were no closer to understanding the full truth, but one thing was certain: they were not alone in their home. Someone, or something, had been there, watching them in the shadows. The following evening, Tom and Sarah knew they could no longer ignore the reality of the situation. The shadow outside Emily's window had left them shaken, and the growls from Max had escalated to an undeniable warning. They had seen enough to know that something or someone was targeting their family. What began as a series of strange growls had transformed into a terrifying, shadowy presence outside their home. The couple decided to take matters into their own hands. After discussing it, they contacted the local police, explaining the strange occurrences and their growing concern for their safety. The police took the situation seriously and promised to send a patrol to monitor the area throughout the night. Sarah and Tom hoped this would bring some peace of mind, but they were also filled with anxiety, unsure of what would happen next. That night, the tension in the house was palpable. Emily, unaware of the mounting fear around her, slept soundly in her room, her peaceful face illuminated by the dim light of the night lamp. Max, however, was on high alert, sitting near the door to Emily's room with his usual intense focus. His growling had become more persistent, more forceful, as if something was drawing closer. Around 2 o'clock a.m., the patrol car arrived, its headlights cutting through the darkness outside. The officer stepped out of the car and walked slowly around the house, checking the windows, the yard, and the surrounding areas for any signs of movement. He had heard Sarah's description of the shadowy figure, but when he didn't find anything out of the ordinary, He gave them a reassuring nod. Tom, still uneasy, accompanied the officer outside to walk around the perimeter of the house. As they reached the back corner of the yard, the officer noticed something unusual: faint tracks leading through the grass toward the window of Emily's room. The tracks were fresh, disturbed only by the soft footprints of someone who had been there recently. "Looks like someone's been snooping around," the officer said, his tone suddenly serious. "But the prints don't lead anywhere. They're too faint. Whoever it was didn't stay long." The officer checked the area around the back fence and found nothing else. No sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had tried to break in. But the tracks were real. Someone had been out there. Max's growls continued, growing louder as the minutes ticked by. He was more agitated than ever. Tom, now standing by the window, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. And then, as if on cue, the figure appeared again. This time, it wasn't a fleeting shadow. The figure was clearly visible outside the window, standing still, staring into Emily's room. Max's growl turned into a full-blown bark, and the dog began scratching at the door, desperate to get outside. The presence was unmistakable, the figure was real, and it was right there watching. Tom's heart raced. "There. Do you see it?" He called to the officer, pointing toward the window. The officer froze, his hand instinctively going to his radio. "Stay here," he instructed Tom, quickly pulling out his flashlight as he moved toward the window. As he got closer, the figure seemed to melt into the shadows, disappearing into the night with alarming speed. Tom rushed to the window, but by the time he looked out, there was no trace of the figure. The yard was silent once more, with no movement, no signs of anyone there. The officer returned to the house, his face grim. "There's something going on here, all right," the officer said, his voice tense. "Whoever it is, they're being careful. We'll keep an eye out, but you should make sure all the lights are on tonight, and lock everything up tight." Tom and Sarah felt a mix of relief and unease. They had seen the figure with their own eyes. It was real, there was no denying it now. But the mystery of who it was, and why they were watching Emily, remained unsolved. Max's growls eventually softened, but his eyes never left the window. It was as if he knew something that they didn't, something hidden in the darkness outside. The following days were tense and filled with uncertainty. Despite the police patrols and the vigilant monitoring, the shadowy figure continued to haunt the edges of the Johnsons' lives. Max remained on edge, his growling at night growing even more intense. It was as if he could sense something that the rest of them could not. Tom and Sarah did everything they could to maintain a sense of normalcy for Emily. They made sure she felt safe, but there was a subtle shift in the air. Their daughter had stopped talking in her sleep, but every night, Max's growls returned with a vengeance, and every morning, the strange sense of unease lingered. The figure never reappeared during the day, but its presence was felt every night when darkness fell. Tom, unable to sleep, spent his nights researching the house. Was there any history of strange events in their area? He found nothing remarkable, just the usual suburban neighborhood reports, with the occasional mention of local wildlife or break-ins. But as he scrolled through pages of old town records, something caught his eye. A brief mention of the house's original owner, a man named Joseph Fields, who had lived there many years ago. The entry was sparse, but one detail stood out. Fields had been a recluse, living alone, and had died under mysterious circumstances. The cause of death was never officially determined, and there were rumors that he had been deeply paranoid, fearing that someone was out to get him. Curious, Tom dug deeper. He learned that Joseph Fields had kept to himself, rarely seen in town, and neighbors spoke of strange noises coming from the house at night. Some even claimed to have seen a shadowy figure in the window, the same type of description that Sarah had given to the police. The realization hit Tom like a cold wave. Could this figure outside their window be connected to the house's past? Could the energy from Joseph Fields' troubled life be lingering in the shadows? The idea seemed far-fetched, but the patterns of strange behavior, Max growling, Emily's sleep disturbances, the shadow, seemed too aligned to ignore. That night, Tom decided to investigate further. He spent hours in the basement of their home, looking through the storage boxes that had been there since they moved in. Among the dust-covered boxes, he found an old journal, yellow with age. It appeared to have belonged to Joseph Fields himself. With trembling hands, Tom opened it and began reading. The entries were disturbing. They spoke of paranoia, fear, and an overwhelming sense that someone or something was watching him. As the journal progressed, the entries became more frantic, with references to protecting the child and keeping them away. The final pages were filled with erratic scribbles and drawings of strange, shadowy figures standing outside his window. Tom's breath caught in his throat. The journal described everything they had been experiencing: the shadows, the growls, and the sensation of something lurking just outside. Joseph Fields had been trying to protect a child. Was that Emily? Had his fear, his paranoia, somehow manifested into the presence they were now dealing with? Suddenly, everything fell into place. The growling, the strange figure, Emily's disturbed sleep. It was as if the past had come back to haunt them, manifesting through Max's instincts and Emily's unexplainable reactions. It wasn't just a shadow outside their window. It was the lingering energy of someone who had been consumed by fear. Max, as it turned out, wasn't just trying to protect Emily from something unknown. He was reacting to the same fear that Joseph Fields had felt all those years ago. And now it seemed that fear had found a way to cross over into their present reality. The revelation about Joseph Fields and his journals sent a shiver down Tom's spine. The realization that the entity they had been dealing with might be tied to the house's past, something that had been festering in the shadows for years, was both terrifying and inexplicable. But now they had a deeper understanding of what they were facing. It wasn't just a random figure lurking outside their window. It was a manifestation of fear born from the troubled soul of Joseph Fields, and it seemed intent on continuing its haunting cycle. Max, the loyal dog they had always trusted, had been reacting to something much deeper than they had initially understood. His growls, his alertness, his fixation on Emily's room. It wasn't just instinct. It was a form of protection, a warning to them that they weren't alone. But Max alone couldn't stop what was coming. The presence wasn't just an external threat. It had been slowly creeping into their lives, feeding off their fear and confusion. Determined to end this once and for all, Tom and Sarah decided to confront the entity head-on. They couldn't let it continue to haunt their family, especially not Emily. They knew that the only way to truly rid themselves of this malevolent force was to face it in the place where it had first taken root, the house itself. That night, as the clock struck 2:00 a.m., they prepared for the most difficult part of their journey. Max, despite his usual growls, sat silently in the corner of the room as if awaiting the final showdown. Emily slept peacefully, unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. The house felt strangely quiet, almost too quiet, as if the air itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Tom and Sarah stood in the living room, staring at the dark hallway that led to Emily's room. They had a plan now. Armed with the knowledge from Joseph Fields' journal, they knew they needed to confront the spirit directly. Together, they would break the cycle of fear, bring the truth to light, and hopefully lay the restless soul to rest. They began by walking slowly through the house, speaking calmly but firmly to whatever might be lurking in the darkness. "We know what you are," Tom said, his voice steady. "We understand your pain, your fear, but it's over now. You don't belong here anymore." As they reached Emily's room, Max suddenly stood up, his eyes fixed on the door. The growling started again, low at first, then rising in intensity. But this time, it wasn't as ominous. There was no fear in his bark, only a sense of resolve. Tom and Sarah stepped into the room together, standing by Emily's bed. They could feel the air shift, a heavy, oppressive energy pressing in around them. They didn't know if it was the right thing to do, but in that moment, they knew they had no choice. They had to face whatever was out there, even if it meant confronting the unknown. As they stood together, holding their ground, the air grew colder, the shadows deepened, and then, just as they had feared, the figure appeared once more. This time, it was clearer than ever. A tall, shadowy shape standing in the corner of Emily's room, its features indistinct but filled with a palpable sense of dread. Max let out a final forceful bark, and the figure began to fade, dissolving like mist in the morning sun. The room seemed to lighten, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as the presence retreated. Emily stirred slightly in her sleep, but didn't wake. Tom and Sarah stood in stunned silence, the weight of the moment sinking in. The shadow was gone. The house felt different now, quieter, more peaceful, as though a long-held tension had finally been released. The next morning, when Emily woke up, everything felt normal again. There was no growling from Max, no strange presence in the air. The house was still, and the world outside seemed a little brighter. The weight that had hung over them for so long was finally gone. In the weeks that followed, the Johnson family lived without the fear that had once gripped them. Max returned to his usual, loving self, no longer acting out of fear or anxiety. And though they would never truly understand everything that had happened in their home, they knew one thing for certain. The shadow that had haunted their lives had been laid to rest, and they could now move forward with peace. As for Joseph Fields, his restless spirit had finally found closure. Whatever fear had once trapped him in this world was now gone, leaving behind only the echoes of a past that had finally been silenced. The Johnsons would never forget the terror they had faced, but they would also never forget the strength it took to confront the unknown and bring peace to their home once and for all.